Hi, everyone. Welcome to At Home with Literati. I am David. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore, and today we are pleased to welcome Saladin Ambar to our At Home with Literati series in support of Stars and Shadows. He'll be joined in conversation by University of Michigan professor Benjamin Peters. And just a quick webinar overview for our attendees. The chat is closed. You can keep the chat window open as I'll be dropping links to purchase the book from Literati through the event. The Q&A is accessible, so please, we encourage that you submit questions to ask later in our event. Live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. And if you're watching later on YouTube, links to purchase the book are in the description. And a reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeastern Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. And most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for being here. And now allow me to introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Saladin Ambar is a professor of political science and senior scholar at the Center on the American Governor at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, where he teaches courses in American politics. He's the author of numerous books, including American Cicero, Mario Cuomo, and the Defense of American Liberalism, and Malcolm X at Oxford Union, which was nominated for a Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Best Book in Nonfiction and is currently in development for a feature film by Number 9 Films in the UK. Benjamin Peters is the director of the Global Scholars Program at the University of Michigan. He earned a PhD in political science from Rutgers University and is a member of the Political Science Research Committee of the Center for Global Non-Killing, a member group of the World Health Organization Violence Prevention Alliance. With Peter Verbeek, he is the co-editor of Peace Ethology, Behavioral Processes and Systems of Peace. All right, take it away, and I'll be back in a few minutes.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Literati Bookstore and Oxford University Press. I'm Benjamin Peters. I'm so glad to be moderating tonight, and it is a great pleasure for me to welcome my friend, Professor Saladin Ambar, to Literati Bookstore's At Home with Literati this evening. Just as by way of self-disclosure, Dean and I have been friends since we met 18 years ago as PhD students at the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University, and I am so honored, Dean, to be in conversation with you tonight, my good friend. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Benjamin. It's a pleasure and really great to see you. I miss you, but it's great to connect virtually and to have this important conversation.
Yeah, I agree. I'm so glad we're together here tonight, even though you are in the city of brotherly love of Philadelphia, and we're here in hot Ann Arbor this evening. And I just wanted to say also that Dean is the father of triplets who are 14. Did they just turn 15 or just turn 14?
Just turned 15.
I thought so. Congratulations to them. And I don't know how you do it all, Dean, but this evening we're going to focus on one thing that you've done very recently, which is the publication of Stars and Shadows, the politics of interracial friendship from Jefferson to Obama. In a minute, Dean, I'm going to ask you to read an excerpt just to sort of set the table for us, but I just want everyone who's joining us this evening who may not have been able to get the book yet, to know that this is an examination of 10 cases of friendships. Sometimes it's 2 friends, sometimes it's 3, but it's 10 cases of friendships that you present here. And these are all relationships between public figures, whether they were elected politicians or appointed officials, whether they were social movement leaders or prophetic religious leaders. And some of them are, of course, public intellectuals, artists, and writers. And I know by using this array of examples, you show us that friendship, interracial friendship, radical friendship has the promise of transcending and perhaps transforming political, market, and social boundaries and relations and moving us toward completion of the democratic project and promise that is a healthy multiracial republic. Dean, would you start us off, please, by reading an excerpt from your book that sets out this project and provides a frame for our conversation tonight?
I'd be happy to do so. So if you permit me, I'll read from the introduction.
Sure.
In the summer of 1998, I moved from Astoria, Queens to Plainsboro, New Jersey. It was my first time living in anything approaching a suburb. All of the apartment complexes were named with great intentionality, lest I forget that. Fox Run, Deer Creek, Quail Ridge, Hunter's Glen. I remember going out for a run in a nearby trail and nearly having a heart attack after what I thought was a rat had crossed my path. It was a rabbit. It was that kind of place. My neighbors would talk to me in passing, and I got to know a few of them in the most superficial way. There was the Indian couple next door, the friendly, cute girl who would catch a smoke on her second floor balcony, a tall, lanky former professional basketball player who, for the sake of anonymity, I will call Paul. Paul was an older Black man who grew up in the South and was now working at one of the nearby high schools. He had 2 Cadillacs, neither of which worked at the same time. He was always outside in the lot, 2 cars, 2 hoods up, figuring out what to do. I noticed that Paul had a friend, an older white guy I'd see him hanging with. They'd stand there talking, laughing. This fellow, I'll call him Peter, was always in his Mercedes with the top down, golf clubs in the back. He was retired. I seem to remember a blonde woman with him on occasion. He liked to wear hats. One Saturday morning, I think I was in a stupor from overeating and watching college football. I heard a knock on my door. It was Paul. "Hey, Dean, can you help out, man? You busy?" "Sure, Paul, what's up?" "It's Peter, man. He's tried to hurt himself. He's upstairs." "Sure, give me a second." I had no idea what to make of what was going on, but I threw on some sweatpants and walked upstairs behind Paul, who was in quite a hurry. I remember being led into the apartment into a bedroom in the back. Sure enough, there was Peter sitting upright in bed, wearing a white t-shirt. He looked alert and just as calm as you would expect someone at home on a Saturday. Then I looked more carefully. There was a black object protruding from Peter's chest, and that black object was surrounded by what was a perfect circle of red blood. I looked again, and I could see that the object was a kitchen knife, the small kind with a grooved wooden handle. Thankfully, I didn't pass out. I walked over to Peter. "Peter, I see you've tried to hurt yourself. Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm okay. It was stupid of me." I had no medical training whatsoever, and I offered what I could. "Peter, do you mind if I pray for you?" "No, not at all." I prayed for Peter, then Paul and I waited for the paramedics to arrive. I don't recall much after that, but I did run into Paul a few weeks later in the lot, 2 Cadillacs, 2 hoods up. "Hey man, how's Peter? Is he all right?" "Yeah, man, thank God he's gonna be okay. He was depressed, just got divorced, lost a lot of money. He's been real sad." I've been haunted by this story for many years, and it's one I've shared with my students on numerous occasions. Here was a man, he lived right upstairs from me. I knew next to nothing about him. As far as I was concerned, he was a rich white guy cruising around playing golf and having the time of his life. I had no connection to him whatsoever. And all I knew of Paul was mostly superficial. Same for the cigarette girl on the porch, the Indian couple next door. I went over once for a Diwali celebration, but other than that, I was clueless. It occurred to me that in my self-absorbed quest to quote unquote do something with my life, I had taken for granted, what's the word? People. I had very little sense of connectivity to my neighbors, and here I was teaching politics and history to my students. I was so self-assured about all I knew about the country, its past and its troubles, but I was utterly oblivious to the pains, heartaches, and lives of those who lived, ate, breathed, and slept around me. Somehow, I began to understand this not only as a personal failing, but truly one with democratic implications. I think this book began in its own way in that bedroom in 1998, standing in front of a man, a knife, and a little circle of blood. You know, the great Black scholar and activist W.E.B. Du Bois had something important to say about all of this, and I'm not sure we've taken him seriously. I'd like to do that in this book. Here's what Du Bois wrote in 1903 in his classic work, The Souls of Black Folk. "In a world where it means so much to take a man by the hand and sit beside him, to look frankly into his eyes and feel his heart beating with red blood. In a world where a social cigar or cup of tea together means more than legislative halls and magazine articles and speeches, one can imagine the consequences of the almost utter absence of social amenities between estranged races whose separation extends to parks and to streetcars." Was this merely a rhetorical flourish? Perhaps Du Bois was overemphasizing just how separated Blacks and whites were in Jim Crow America. And even if true 120 years ago, surely cigars and tea can't mean more than legislative halls. Daniel S. Allen put it this way in her powerful work on race and citizenship in America. Is interracial distrust, in fact, a political problem, as opposed to, say, simply an embarrassment? The answer is clearly yes. The value of friendship as a fundamental quality of representative government can be traced as far back as the Greece, up until the Enlightenment era, where revolutionary France placed fraternité on par with liberté and égalité. As Wilson Carey McWilliams wrote in his magisterial work, The Idea of Fraternity in America, Greek philosophy saw fraternity as a necessity of life and politics. Life might be seen as a hierarchy of fraternities, the fraternity of blood yielding to that of association, which in turn yielded to that of the city. The movement from Greek to Christian fraternitas, the brotherhood and sisterhood of faith, to fraternité involved secularizing the idea of fraternity and binding it to the calls for emancipation. The crucial distinction for the United States has been its size and diversity, twin obsessions of the founders. Where the Greek polis and their more modern counterparts, the Italian city-states, shared in a republican vision for political rule, they were small, largely homogeneous polities. Even the Roman Republic, the principal guiding light for the early American experiment in self-government, dissolved into empire and then anarchy. James Madison presumed that the expansiveness of America's territory would actually serve as an advantage for national unity, as opportunities for faction to work its mischief would be countermanded by the sheer multitude of differences, along with a compound federal form of government. All of this was made possible through, though unmentioned in the Constitution, by the presumption of chattel slavery and the exclusion of Native Americans and women from political life. Whiteness, above all, was the bonding ingredient to the foundation of American citizenship. Each of the case studies presented in this book centers around how this democratic project might have been made possible through the seemingly less political domain of social relations. Whether it be an invitation to W.E.B. Du Bois from William James to a private dinner at Harvard, for example, or marching together in Washington, once for jobs and freedom, as did James Baldwin and Marlon Brando, or marching for women's liberation, as did co-chairs Angela Davis and Gloria Steinem during the 2017 Women's March, or when Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel locked arms on the front lines in Selma. Displays of interracial friendship have frequently served as proverbial barometers as to whether equals deciding together in public was a valuable enterprise. On occasion, such engagements have produced disagreements among the protagonists themselves, often around the meaning and significance of their respective endeavors. The business of friendship can be messy under ordinary circumstances. When imbued with the added pressure of consciousness-making politics, it can be nearly impossible. In speaking of politics and friendship throughout the book, I hope to expand the ordinary meaning of both words. Friendship as a private social bond marked by amity and trust, perhaps the most important quality of all, is well enough. While I speak of friendship in Stars and Shadows in this sense, I also wish to implicate the larger sense of friendship as an essential characteristic of democracy and one of the more powerful responsibilities of citizenship. Friendship may be a more superfluous, albeit admired aspect of citizenship in ethnically or racially homogeneous republics. This is not so for large, multiracial republics. Thus, politics in the sense I employ in the text, it is also about the creation of meaning out of social realities and all efforts to reshape them. As Daniel S. Allen has argued in her reflections on Aristotle, friendship is the bond of the city, and political friendship is not merely a serviceable aspiration, but a crucial one. Finally, while researching for this book the past 2 years, I've sought out not only historical, but also literary examples of what a robust multiracial democracy looks like. Like countless others, I've been drawn to the story of Denver and Seppa in Toni Morrison's Beloved. Equally poignant is the bond between Ishmael and Queequeg in Herman Melville's Moby Dick. The best models all seem inherently premised upon friendship, a bond that, unlike romantic love, holds no physical allure over us, and unlike familial ties, obligations to our friends are essentially self-generated. Sex and blood titillate, but friendship is the stuff of democracy. It is sustaining because it is voluntary and visionary at the same time. It is also a delicate and difficult enterprise, particularly among people taught, trained, and conditioned to believe that above all members of society, there is one group deemed intellectually, aesthetically, and politically superior to all. So no, we cannot, quote unquote, friend our way out of white supremacy, but friends can and must be part of its undoing. The title of this book comes from what I believe to be a sacred and noble model, one not unclouded by its own time and points of reference, but a worthy one all the same. Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn provides, at least to me, a glimpse of what the path to true and unequivocal friendship might mean for our country. Stars and Shadows comes from a passage in Huckleberry Finn where Jim and Huck are at flight at night and about to board a raft to some still unrecognizable freedom. Students of philosophy will appreciate that it is quite literally time for the two to decamp from the cave wherein they have been living. As in Plato's allegory of the cave, their vision is limited. They have only enough light to see with, but not enough to be discovered by. Stars and shadows ain't good to see by, Huck narrates as the two continue their uncertain journey. Like many, I've been struck by how much Twain could get into such a simple sentence. As Jim and Huck were late 19th century metaphors for what those with little standing in society could do in friendship, so it is with the idea that our efforts to remake our democracy today needn't be perfect nor wondrously illuminated. The friendship between Jim and Huck is the path. They are the stars and shadows. The search for a direction out of white supremacy and all other manner of anti-democratic ills must first be an inward one. This is not to the exclusion of well and real well-lit paths marked by law, public policy, and societal transformation. But the real light is nameless, it is internal, and it is the work of friends. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean, for sharing that excerpt from the introduction. I think it makes me forget that you're a political science and an academic because your prose is so engaging and beautiful. And this book is so well written. And I want to say that, you are a political scientist. This is well researched, it's methodical. And I think, there's a simple definition of politics that you and I learned, which is politics is who gets what, when, and where. And I think what you show here in the introduction and throughout the book is that who gets what, when, and where, and how is not only about clean water or security, but it's about acknowledgement and respect. It's about dignity. It's about friendship, public friendship. So thank you so much for setting the table for us with the introduction there. There are a lot of cases in the book. Each chapter is one of the cases, and I wish we had time to talk about them all. I'd like to choose a few and ask you some questions from my reading of the text to share with us. I also want folks who are joining us to know that if you have questions, if you've joined us after we began, you're welcome to put questions into the Q&A, and we'll be entertaining those questions maybe in about 20, 25 minutes. My first question for you, Dean, is on your chapter on Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, which is the second chapter of the book. In the chapter, you write that theirs was perhaps the first great bond between an American president and the head of a social movement. And that, quote, the friendship was clearly not of the kind that either man had cultivated with others over their many combined years, end quote. And I think you showed that their relationship was significant for a number of reasons, including the dynamics of disagreement and trust, the notion of trust that you just brought up in the introduction. but also the very visible and public declarations of their friendships, including by Lincoln at the White House. Could you tell us about both of those dimensions of their relationship, the significance of trust and building trust, and also the very public nature of their professed friendship?
Certainly, many of us are familiar with the fact that Lincoln and Douglas met. I'm not so sure many of us know they met 3 times, but before their first meeting, Douglas had a truly skeptical, that's a polite word, view of Lincoln based on his earlier somewhat moderate policies with respect to the expansion of slavery. And he deplored Lincoln's prevarications, including his first inaugural address. And by the time he met Lincoln for the first time in 1863 in person, he was pretty hot. Douglas had 2 sons in the Civil War, and Black soldiers were being paid less than white soldiers. Douglas called Lincoln to task on this in person. And Lincoln pushed back. Douglas accused him of changing his mind on fundamental policy. Lincoln said, hey, I don't change my mind. I may come slow to making up my mind, but once I'm there, I'm rock solid, in so many words. There was some back and forth in that conversation, and Douglas didn't leave entirely pleased with Lincoln's responses. But the level of trust that he had going in increased measurably, because as he left the meeting, he went and told his friends and others, I felt big in there. I was never made aware of my color or that I was anything but an equal to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had demonstrated that he could talk to Douglas as a Black man, not as a Black man, but as a person, as a human being. And with that meant disagreements, but disagreements among equals. It was a very important moment. Certainly by the 3rd meeting, after the 2nd inaugural address, Douglas, after hearing Lincoln espouse what he called a sermon about the sins of the nation, and that the blood drawn by the lash must be paid by the blood drawn by the sword, as we know from the 2nd inaugural address. Douglas made a beeline to the White House thereafter to congratulate Lincoln on this somber but powerful speech. He was detained. He was not allowed in initially as a Black man. He was told that we've been instructed that no men of color should be allowed into this meeting. By this point, though, Douglas knew that that was false. He said no such order could have emanated from Abraham Lincoln. That level of trust had increased. Finally, when he's in the meeting or in the White House, they make another attempt. This is the guards, the white officers, if you will, make an effort to remove him from the White House still. And Douglas calls out to someone, hey, go find Abraham Lincoln. They're getting rid of me. Lincoln finally comes and sees what's happening and calls out before everyone, here is my friend Douglas. That language really and truly was the beginning of the new birth of freedom that I think Lincoln hoped for. We would pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after Lincoln's assassination. We would begin the process of amending our Constitution, but Lincoln understood we had to amend our hearts. We had to recognize these newly freed people, not simply as fellow citizens, but also as friends. A very powerful moment.
Thank you so much, Dean, for sharing that reflection on the chapter and on the relationship, the very public nature of the friendship and relationship between Lincoln and Douglas. I found that chapter so compelling, and your retelling of it here just reemphasizes the important symbolic nature, but also the substantive nature of the friendship in trust through disagreement, which is a theme that comes back again and again through the book. I'm going to jump now to a more recent friendship, and that is the one in which you mentioned in the introduction that you just read from, between James Baldwin and Marlon Brando. And you write about the chance meeting of the two in Greenwich Village in the late 40s, just after the war. And you write that they shared, quote, a kind of confrontational honesty that allows one to challenge their society at the risk of losing their own personal success. Again, an indication of trust through disagreement as one of the hallmarks of an authentic and radical friendship. Could you tell us about the development of Baldwin and Brando's friendship and its significance both privately and publicly for the two of them, including its significance to the civil rights movement and other liberatory movements of the time?
certainly. Well, it's funny that Hector's Cafe where they met in the village is still there. I happened upon it by accident. I wish I could tell you I went to research where it was. I was just having a fun afternoon in New York, walking around with a good friend. And there it was, Hector's Cafe. And that's where they met. Baldwin meets Brando there. Brando walks into the cafe and notices Baldwin and Norman Mailer, the writer, in an argument, takes a seat between them, and all of a sudden, one of the great literary and cultural friendships begins that day. Baldwin was trying to become an actor. Brando was already honing his skills at the New School for Social Research in becoming an actor. They met over this common interest. But what began to happen was that Baldwin's background began to, in effect, radicalize Brando, who had not really been exposed to racism where he grew up, had not really seen it, in the stark light that it was presented to him by Baldwin. And he was moved by it. The two began a real friendship, but it was also a kind of intellectual growth for Brando, so much so that by the late 60s, it's Brando who's introducing Baldwin to members of the Black Panther Party, not the other way around. The cultural significance is there because the two sought in their own ways to address sort of the inhumane qualities that bedeviled America. But more importantly, the effort was there to take it to another level politically. During the March on Washington, Brando and Baldwin both gather together. Baldwin comes in from Paris after having participated in a march there for jobs and freedom, an extension of the one in the United States. And he and Brando lock arm in arm. And there are many photographs of them. Perhaps you all have seen them, those who are listening and watching now, of the two embracing. Well, yes, they were jovial and loved one another and cared deeply, perhaps amorously for one another. But more to the point, those photographs and images on television were to show and demonstrate to America, this is what is possible. This is what multiracial democracy looks like. Incidentally, they both attended an after March conference, a panel, a round table. It's still available on YouTube. You can watch it. March on Washington YouTube panel or round table discussion. And there's Baldwin, there's Brando calling the United States to task for its hypocrisy. And it's quite stark and strident and very powerful, but it was all made possible because of a friendship. And the two of them frequently in their own lives went off script, if you will, to challenge America to be better than it had been presenting itself for centuries at that point. And so the relationship was significant. And there was a moment where they had fallen out of favor with one another. And we don't know. The record is sort of unclear as to how that happened. But I begin the chapter with a letter from Baldwin to Brando saying, "Can we become friends again? I've written a script for you, Marlon, the script of a lifetime." And what Baldwin is trying to do is to get Brando to play a part in his Giovanni's Room, the great novel that was path-breaking, groundbreaking in its own way because of the issue of homosexuality that was the center of it. Very risque and verboten for the time. And he wanted Brando to play the older cafe owner from Giovanni's Room. Even there, coming together to speak about the interests and power needed for marginalized people. By the time Brando is nominated and ultimately receives an Oscar for his portrayal of the Godfather in that famed and beloved film, he is so radicalized and so conscious of so many issues that he refuses to receive the Oscar, the Academy Award, and presents in his stead a Native American woman who receives it and gives a speech that not many received well at the Academy Awards that night, but Brando didn't care a whit. He at that point had different priorities in his life, and that was because he had met James Baldwin.
Thank you for sharing that trajectory of their relationship. And I think, in my reading of the book, I think this is one of the most intimate friendships that you portray. Contemporaries of theirs, who you also tell about in the book, are Gloria Steinem and Angela Davis. And their relationship does not seem to be as close and intimate, but they do have this long sustained relationship. And I think of all of the relationships you present in Stars and Shadows, it is perhaps the longest relationship, starting in 1962 and continuing through the present, now 60 years. And you start with the first time they met in Helsinki in 1962, and then you continue up through the January 2017 March, Women's March on Washington, which they were honorary co-chairs of after the election of Trump. What are the significant touch points in their relationship over 60 years? And tell us how you characterize their relationship. I don't think it's as intimate as Baldwin's and Brando's, but how do you see their relationship as significant, as a signal to the promise and possibilities of interracial friendship?
Well, it's fascinating to me, and I think you're quite right. The length of that relationship, bears repeating and consideration. They're both attendees at the 1962 Communist Youth Forum Conference in Helsinki. Steinem is there to, in so many words, denigrate, I think that's not too strong a word, the communist movement, and place it in the context that she thinks is important, namely that American liberalism is sufficient and we don't need communist youth gatherings. We're fine with where we're heading.
And sponsored by the US government.
and she is sent there, frankly, by the Central Intelligence Agency that later is revealed and Gloria Steinem would later acknowledge. Angela Davis is there because she's becoming a communist, because she believes in Marxist teachings and is highly anti-capitalist during her college years. And so there's this initial bifurcation, this separation of ideas. These are not people you would mark out as friends initially. These are not folks who you would mark out as having, of coming to a point of agreement on, significant matters of politics. But yet when Angela Davis is arrested and accused and charged with killing a judge, the weapons that were presumably in her ownership or belonged to her were used in the killing of a judge in California. And the Free Angela Davis movement began. Many people, I'm sure, are aware of it, have heard about it, or seen it in films. Gloria Steinem took a considerable risk in becoming the treasurer for that movement to free Angela Davis. And she did so by helping to raise funds for her defense. Now, by this point in the early 70s, Gloria Steinem had written about the Black Power movement. She had written about Black Power first and then women's liberation. She herself had come to understand what Kimberly Crenshaw and others have later coined intersectionality, that we can't have feminism and an understanding of feminism without an understanding of the need for Black women to be at the core and center of that movement. The risk she took, again, was considerable, and she lost, jobs and money. But she felt Angela Davis had taken even greater risk in the liberation of her people, and ultimately, in the betterment of the United States in the fight for anti-racism. Steinem later would, reject the policies of incarceration, mass incarceration. She would later in her life, stand for the freedom of Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was accused of killing a police officer here in Philadelphia. I mean, these were not lightweight stances to take for someone who was a quote unquote moderate liberal within the feminist movement. They were quite radical stances to take. But, you're right. The relationship was always a little bit distant in the sense that they never really, they were not dining together. They were not sharing tea and cigars, if you will, to go back to that early Du Boisian metaphor. But what they did have was profound respect, and the trust or distrust that emanated from that first meeting grew to great trust, and then friendship, and then I would say even love, because by 2017, it had been established that their politics had to be centered on friendship and also a mutual understanding of what Trumpian fascism represented in their estimation to the trajectory of the future of the United States. And so they organized that march as symbolic bearers of the past, but also a future that incorporated Black and white women and other women, Indigenous, Latino, Asian women and others, members of the LGBTQ community were centered in that march as well, that we had to go back to go forward. And that's what having Steinem and Davis at the front of that march as co-chairs was really all about. It was quite something, and ultimately, I think, indicative of a relationship that, while not marked by, sort of the touchstones of, friendship that we might share among intimates, it nevertheless symbolically was so powerful that I think, its significance cannot be underestimated as what it stood for and stands for today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dean. Thank you. There's one other thing I want to ask you about. I'm going to kind of jump in my thinking to this question. It's not in the book, but it's something you and I have talked about. Your last chapter is on President Obama and Vice President Biden, now President Biden, and their friendship. And I think there's something that happens when Obama is in his first term that harks back to W.E.B. Du Bois's quote on a world where a social cigar or a cup of tea together means more than legislative halls and magazine articles and speeches. And that is what was called the Beer Summit in 2009. For those who might not recall, this was an event convened by President Obama at the Rose Garden, where he and then Vice President Joe Biden had been together, had beers together, with Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., a Black man, and a Cambridge, Massachusetts police officer, James Crowley, a white man who had arrested Gates for essentially breaking into his own house when he had accidentally locked himself out. So through the lens of your work in Stars and Shadows, what do you think was the intended significance of the 2009 Beer Summit? Do you think President Obama was trying to show amity and trust and fraternity through that Beer Summit? And what about the public reaction to that as well?
I think you're spot on to point it out, and I think the answer is yes. Obama was trying to use the model of breaking bread, drinking beer in this case, supping together, smoking cigars, what have you. To illustrate what can ease tensions, create a level of trust through regular acts that everyone may, or maybe not everyone, but many enjoy and participate in, that are familiar. And if we can sit around in a garden and have a beer, then we may not be able to change the world, but we can start to see one another as human. We can start to see one another as fellow travelers. And we can begin the process of seeing one another as friends. And then citizenship becomes a lot easier. Democracy becomes a lot easier. When we're alienated, when Officer Crowley sees Skip Gates as an angry Black man, and when Skip Gates sees Crowley as this crazy white cop, we're at an impasse. Yeah. We're at an impasse. And I think Obama was wise and also shrewd in putting Biden in the mix, because Biden, I think, has always historically represented, not just someone who is, a long-serving person in America's government, a long, lengthy political history, but is sort of as, a working class representative of the white working class, of middle America. And I think Obama understood that Biden's attendance would be critical to elevating that meeting to something beyond just a confrontation between him and Officer Crowley. Sometimes you've got to extend the length of the table, if you will, and have others involved to demonstrate the parameters of the democracy you're trying to have. And I thought that was illustrative. If only I had included it in the book.
No. Well, actually, I was looking it up again recently, and the Cambridge, Massachusetts police union wouldn't allow Officer Crowley to appear there just with President Obama and Henry Louis Gates Jr. They wanted another white man there, and they suggested Joe Biden, which, because of Biden's long career and his, like you said, his own journey in American politics, did lengthen the table, maybe unexpectedly in the ways that the Cambridge Mass Police Union thought. Yeah. I know we want to save time for questions, but I just want to ask you to read one more short excerpt. Your book and the cases you narrate are about the politics of radical fraternity, as you put it. But in the conclusion, in what I think echoes Martin Luther King Jr.'s politics, you even bring up the foundation of radical friendship on radical love. And you've mentioned that here tonight. Could you please share those opening 2 paragraphs of your final conclusion that begins on 203, and then we'll take some questions?
Absolutely.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. As the United States moves toward becoming a majority-minority nation, one might presume that the need or value for political displays of interracial friendship may be behind us. Yet the movement toward a more democratic and inclusive America has always been fraught with violent moments of backlash and disavowals of progress. If the political history of interracial friendship teaches us anything, it is that the symbolic value of demonstrating moral commitments to not only legislative acts, but also those of the heart matter a great deal. At the very least, they are instructive of the overarching state of affairs and where the nation might be headed. This is especially true during moments of perceived vulnerability among whites: the Haitian Revolution, the Nat Turner Rebellion, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act, and now our period of profound demographic change, one that has made the votes of whites no longer uniquely decisive. The assault on the nation's capital on January 6, 2021 by white nationalist Trump supporters and insurrectionists revealed, oddly enough, the deep connection between democracy and communal bonds. When those bonds fray, as they have throughout American history, they are suggestive of authoritarianism's appeal. If those whom I deem to be inferior or otherwise illegitimately disposed to govern themselves, let alone me, share in political power, then I am less likely to turn towards democratic forms. I am, on the contrary, more likely to reject them. For in a large, diverse republic such as ours, we must make common ground in recognizing not only the rules of democratic society, but also its virtues. And there can be no meaningful acceptance of rules with those whom you fear, absent an inward psychological and, dare I say, spiritual shift in how one sees their fellow citizens. Lincoln understood this as well as anyone. This is the new birth of freedom, he stated at Gettysburg. It goes deeper than voting, canvassing, marching, or even elections, as sacred as they are. For democratic life requires bonds of affection and abiding trust that you may not like the decisions made by democratic majorities, constituted by those who may not look, believe, and feel the same as you do, but you nevertheless prefer those decisions to those won by violence out of respect for them, perhaps even love. And if one can implore such a thing in light of recent days revealing democracy's tragic vulnerability, one could say must love.
Thank you, Dean.
Thank you.
Thank you. David, we'll welcome questions if you have some there in the queue. Thank you so much, Dean, for the reading and conversation, and we'll see what questions have come through now.
Yeah, we do have some questions. Just a reminder to everybody, you can still submit questions for a few more minutes. I have some comments about how they're enjoying the reading and your conversation, so congrats on that. And then a viewer asked, they think they understand the point of the constructive value of friendship, but they're wondering about your thoughts on the pressure people might feel to build or maintain friendships with people who do them harm. For instance, moments when a friendship doesn't give room for one to express one's full identity, whether it's about race or other key identifying characteristics.
So I think that's an important question. And friendship doesn't require someone becoming a doormat or abdicating their sense of dignity. You know, Douglas always held his dignity, and many of the exemplars in these cases maintained their dignity, and sometimes it requires pushing back. But I will say this, you know, I think we've all experienced moments when talking with, if not friends, prospective friends or strangers, when there's a moment when we can retreat and not engage because we understand it may be difficult. And, you know, there's a price to pay, as the author of that question rightly notes. There's a price to pay in engaging and making yourself vulnerable and perhaps suffering needlessly. But I would only argue that there's also a price to pay in not engaging. And I also think, frankly, we've been paying that price. And we're down to a few tools. I hate to say this about American democracy. I mean, this is the skeptic in me. We're down to a few tools that remain, that are in our arsenal, if you will, as citizens, to combat what I think is the steady, if not slow, decline in the hardiness of our democracy. And one of those tools is friendship. One of those tools is reaching out and crossing across racial and other kinds of boundaries. I think I would ask all of us to risk taking the chance to be hurt. And I say this as a Black man with children who are African American. I don't want them hurt. I don't want to make them suffer needlessly. But I also understand that that's, in a sense, part of the price for bettering the world we're in. And it's a difficult thing, and certainly no one can make you. But just ask yourself, when you have that moment of retreat or advancement, which is the greater calling? And I would say it's the risk to be made in attempting to, if not win over a friend, then certainly to influence that person's heart as best you can. That's how I feel about it.
Thank you, Dean.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Any other questions? Otherwise, I will throw it back to y'all for a few more minutes to wrap up. I'll let you know if there are any more questions that slide in, though.
Dean, thank you for sharing your answer on that. I recently read about a Indian American woman, a PhD student in anthropology, who went to Scandinavia and was doing research on neo-Nazis in Scandinavia. And she eventually got to know some of them very well, was invited to dinner with them. And one of the things she said in the podcast I was listening to, I wish I could remember the exact citation. I think it's from American University's podcast on extremist politics. She said that one of the profound things she realized was it was relationships that got them into the neo-Nazis. And one of her concluding remarks was, despite the risks, it may only be relationships that get them out of the neo-Nazis, which I think echoes in some ways the point you're making for us here in the United States in this critical moment of our history. Dean, I had another question for you about what might not be in the book. Are there some friendships you considered but you didn't include in the book, and why? Or if you had more time or more pages, who might you have included that you didn't?
It's a great question, and I'm often given help by readers and friends who say, "Hey, why didn't you include Basquiat and Warhol or Pee Wee Reese and Jackie Robinson?" And I thought of Bill Russell and Bob Cousy. I thought of athletes as a possible window into American society, and I just, for a variety of reasons, space, but also there was a question of having more women involved in these chapters as well. I think that was important. But to answer your question, yeah, sure, there were some I thought of, but I think I got the right concentration of examples from different kinds of categories. And certainly what I hope readers come away with is a reflection on, yeah, there are so many other cases that could be used. And I want readers to think about them, past and present. But what I really hope readers of Stars and Shadows will come away with is an opportunity for them to reflect on their own friendships, their own interracial friendships, or maybe those that are lacking, or maybe those that have weakened or frayed over the years, and to consider how they too may engage and travel by stars and shadows. As fraught as that journey may be, there's enough light there to make it. And I hope readers discern in their own lives an opportunity to make that happen. That's really, I think, the purpose behind the book.
We do have one more question from someone who's curious about how we can move between the interpersonal and the structural. If we've discredited the idea that simply having diverse friends makes one non-racist, what can friendship do to create structural change? Do changed hearts change structures?
Well, I think it's a great question. I thank you for asking it on their behalf. Look, I don't think we can do this is not an either or proposition. Let me begin with that. And I don't say that to be trite. I say that to say that our institutions can only do so much. They're critical. And I do believe, at the end of the day, we have to go back to what I would call the blocking and tackling, the fundamentals of democracy in moments of its greatest peril and vulnerability. When you're down by 20 at the half, your coach is going to tell you, hey, you're not dribbling correctly. You're not playing defense. The basics, you go back to the basics. What are the basics of the democracy? How do we extend the greater sense of we? How do we enlarge that circle? And I think it's through friendship. So yes, I think it's going to take both. And finally, I think to model it in person, in other words, to take those private friendships and to make them public, to have them serve some public good or benefit, I think ultimately is critical. Americans have always had interracial friendships from the very beginning. We know this. I mean, there's lots of records of that. And we've had, those relationships have been sexual, they've involved marriages, they've involved friendship. We've had a ton of them. What we haven't always had are the public kind, the kind that have a democratic purpose and project behind them that are instructive to the nation. That we haven't always had. And I think we need to continue to have those, and we need to, increase their presence and manage them as best we can in a moment such as ours, where democracy is fugitive, as the late Sheldon Wolin of Princeton University once called it. It's on the run, just like Jim and Huck.
Mm.
The person who asked that question really liked your answer. So I have one short, probably just like a yes or no sort of answer. Someone is wondering if you've considered a young adult adaptation of this book. They think teens would be particularly interested in this topic.
I hope my publicist Gabe is listening. You hear that, Gabe? Gabe, are you out there? It's a great idea. Gabe, where are you? I have not thought of that, but I certainly can see it for sure. So I'll get back to Oxford University Press on that suggestion. Thank you for the question and really the suggestion.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you both for joining us tonight on At Home with Literati. And thank you to everyone who showed up as viewers. Make sure you buy the book. The link is in the chat on the event listing that brought you here. And of course, in our store, come to our website. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you at the next event.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, David. Thanks for everyone for
joining. Good night, everyone. Thank you for attending.